unarmed, originally from Sweden. I did my PhD within peace studies, and I did it on Gandhi. And part of the reason of having this roundtable is mine and ours understanding that peace studies and conflict studies has taken a while to become mainstreamed, and it has meant a lot of advantages in forms of a number of departments and centers around in the world. And that's been happening in Sweden too, not just here in the US as we know, but in many other places. A part of that advantage has been that people have gotten positions, possibilities of funding, research on a number of topics. But part of the problem has been, according to my understanding at least, that the mainstreaming has meant that we have lost some of the connection to the social movements, to the grassroots, where I would claim that the history of peace and conflict studies comes from the peace movement, the feminist movement, the anticolonial movement in India. These kind of struggles are the historical roots of why we have this academic type of field. All right? And then the question is it possible to revive that? Why should we? And what would that involve? Well, to cut a long story short, I can say that the creation of resistance studies that happened by some people connected to the University of Gothenburg in Sweden some 12 years ago or something like that, has been from people that self-identify as refugees from peace studies. That kind of are looking for a new possibility of how to revive and how to connect to unarmed struggles in social movements and engagement with domination, exploitation, and systems of violence in different ways. We created a resistance studies network, number of panels at different conferences, and with time it became also books and research projects, and then the Journal of Resistance Studies that now has been going on for 7 years. And you have some copies laying here then. So within this, there has been this idea that resistance studies might be a way to find other connections to movements, other connections to other forms of nonviolent resistance that kind of have gotten forgotten or marginalized within the established peace and conflict studies field. Just to give you one example, and then I'll give over the word to Maiken to give other examples. One of my latest books is about everyday resistance. And I think everyday resistance is a concept that has been developed outside of peace studies. It comes from peasant studies, particularly from James Scott, and the work that they have done to understand how people are resisting in very repressive environments when the price of resistance is very, very high. And his colleagues' findings have been that people are doing resistance, but in more hidden and disguised ways, in more individual, scattered ways. And that this can have a cumulative effect that can be very powerful when many people are adopting these forms of resistance. Some people then have picked up on this and created the concept of everyday peace. People like Oliver Richmond and Roger McGinty in the Journal of Peace and Development, in their critique of the liberal peace paradigm within the field of international relations. So, obviously, there seems to be some people then recognizing the potential of these everyday forms of resistance as being important and part of the field of peace and conflict, right? And therefore, the book that I and another colleague, Anna Johansson, wrote together was an attempt to kind of broaden that field from very much being connected to peasant studies to broaden it more into, let's say, transdisciplinary sociology or political science in a broader sense. So that's one field where I think resistance studies, with its focus on all forms of unarmed or peaceful forms of resistance, can make a contribution to peace and conflict studies. All right, Maiken, please.
Yes, thank you. Okay, my name is Maiken Juhl Sørensen. I'm from Scandinavia. I live in Sweden. I was born in Denmark. I work in Norway. I have prepared a little PowerPoint to keep myself on track, but I don't dare touch anything here. So, in case we lose man and Polly, so I'll just, speak from my notes, and you'll have to imagine the photos in your mind, because otherwise I'm afraid we'll just lose them. Okay, so what I wanted to start off with our discussion is a bit of work I've been doing together with Jørgen Johansen on what we call nonviolent conflict escalation. And this is an area where we don't use the term resistance studies, but this is, I think, is an example that fits in, shows very well how resistance studies and peace studies are linked, and how these studies have, like these roots that Stellan was mentioning about how becoming, as a discipline, it comes from nonviolent movements that we're really struggling to change. So Stellan was talking about mainstream peace studies. In what I would consider mainstream peace studies, there's a strong tendency to portray conflicts as something negative, as something problematic. It's very often associated with violence, or even confused with violence. People say conflict when they actually mean war, or people say conflict when they mean violent conflict. And I think it's really important to make a distinction between conflict and violence, because they're two very different things. And because it's not necessary to have violent conflicts. And I think you are all aware of this. And kind of when you think about it, yes, of course. But still, even in this conference, I've heard people talk about conflict when they mean violence or war. Because a lot of the conflicts we do have, they do not necessarily have to be violent. They can be opportunities to learn and to grow if they are handled wisely. And this is often recognized when we're talking about interpersonal conflicts. And if you're talking with people who come from a kind of conflict resolution background at that level, they will talk about conflict as something, to grow, that makes you grow, you'll learn from it. And it's something that has to be handled. But when it comes to the societal level, we are not making this distinction the same way. We're not talking about conflict the same way, at least not in the mainstream peace studies. And I think a lot of you probably are, and that's really great, but I think that's also something that we need to kind of remember and bring into conversation with other scholars of peace studies. And for nonviolent social movements, conflict escalation is kind of the way to bring issues on the agenda that has not been on the agenda before, to kind of escalate conflicts in order to get them recognized as conflicts, so that something can be done about them. So it's not that the conflict has not been there before, it's just that it has been not recognized as a conflict and as something that has to be dealt with. And since I'm happy to be visiting this country for the first time in my life, I think it's fine also to mention the civil rights movement as a good example of where this connection comes in. And I had a quite long quote from Martin Luther King that I wanted to share with you. I don't want to read it all because my English is not so good for that. And I just stumbled across it. So this is from the letter from a Birmingham jail, and I think a lot of you will be familiar with it, where King is asking how we are calling for nonviolent direct action that seeks to create crisis and foster tension, so that a community that has refused to negotiate is forced to confront this issue of segregation. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with but that's really the same. It's very similar to the way I'm talking about escalation. You have to make an issue that's not recognized, like this, like the segregation, and make it an issue to discuss. So these are really important roots of our discipline. So together with Jørgen Johansen, we developed this 5 ways of, we kind of try to identify, okay, what does this escalation mean? What can it look like? How different can it be? And what ways can you escalate conflict with nonviolent means? So we identified 5 different ways of escalation, and these are kind of overlapping. So it's not like either or. When I'm going to mention these 5, don't think about them as kind of either this or that. They kind of weave into each other, and some movements might emphasize one type of escalation more than others, and so many of them may use 2 or 3 kind of really successful movements in achieving their goals. So the first type of escalation, here I have a photo from Tahrir Square in Egypt, would be to be like in a quantitative way. So, and that's quite intuitive for many movements. You bring in more people, you stay longer, you mobilize different parts of the population, you try to get people engaged from different parts of the country, different classes, different ethnic groups, if you have that, different religions. So that's kind of intuitive, I would say, that, yeah, get in more people, do more things, get them to stay longer. But then we also looked at identified 4 other types of more qualitative escalation, I would say. And the first one we've called is escalating through innovation. So when you are innovating new tactics, that's one way of escalating the conflict with nonviolent means. So an example of that I think also many of you might be familiar with, but just to get your mind thinking about this. For instance, Greenpeace has been really good at this, of being innovative in their tactics, especially in the 1980s, in my opinion. Now they're just repeating what they've done before, not so much innovation. But for instance, when they first started to sail in these little rubber boats between the whales and the whale hunters to protect the whales, that was like completely new, innovative way of escalating the conflict. And this became so big, there was so much media attention around this, and eventually it led to a very dramatic footage and these whalers shooting the harpoons to kill the whale over the head of the activists in these little boats. And sit-ins from the civil rights movement is another example of an innovation of a new way of doing activism. And of course you cannot kind of continue these innovations all the time, you can't do it all the time, but the first time you do things, it's very different from when you're doing it like the 50th time. Okay, so the second kind of qualitative way is through provocation. And very often this would be something related to either religion or sex. That's like good themes for escalating through provocations. And that, of course, it depends on the context. And here I have an example from Pussy Riot, that I'm also sure a lot of you are familiar with, performing this punk prayer in a cathedral, provoking Putin and the Orthodox Church. Okay, so that's another example. And I forgot what number we got to, but the next one is dilemma creation. So creating a dilemma for the opponent, so that the opponent has to make a choice between 2 or more bad options from their perspective. So no matter what they do, they lose. And this is also something that is very familiar from nonviolent movements. Here I have an example from Norwegian total resistors. So young men who were resisting both the conscription and the alternative service, civil service. They thought that that was integrated into the military system, so they refused both. This was a group in Norway that did a jail in. So one of their friends was in prison, and then 10 of his friends climbed into the prison. So they literally climbed over the prison wall, jumped into the prison, and demanded to be imprisoned together with their friend because they were having the same beliefs. So this is not something I recommend in all contexts, but in Norway, they did not want extra inmates, so they were kind of carried out of the prison. And that creates a dilemma then for the prison authorities. What should they do about these people who demand to be in prison? If they let them stay, you give them what they want, but then if you carry them out, it also becomes like a big publicity stunt. And then what do you do with them? How do you punish them? Send them to prison? Okay, so the last one, we're getting to the end. The last one is conflict escalation through persistence. So kind of being stubborn, staying put no matter what, and continuing just year after year after year after year of doing what you have been doing. And the example that I have put up was deliberately a little bit controversial. I have took the Zapatistas from Chiapas, Mexico, who have been doing, and the reason it's a bit controversial is that they had this brief military uprising in 1994. So, I think in this context, I suspect that there might be some people say, no, that's not really non-violent. But since then, since 1994, they have consistently used only non-violent methods, even if they're not talking about non-violence using that terminology. If you look at what they're actually doing, it is, I would say, non-violent resistance. And that even if they are attacked, even if people get killed, they're not taking out the guns, they're using the international solidarity networks as the best way of defending themselves. I'm hoping we could maybe get back to talk more about that theme and that issue, since it's also something that we have been, Stella and I have been writing about in relation to what we call constructive resistance. So maybe the debate will take us there, maybe not. We'll see. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. So then we're giving the digital floor to first Polly and then Matt.
No, I think Polly has to be in reverse.
Okay,
So
great.
there's Matt first and then Polly.
That works fine. Very good. Then we take it like that. And the idea is that the two of you are then giving other examples of resistance studies and its relation to peace and conflict studies. So then, Matt, please.
All right, so can you see and hear me over there?
Yeah, you're now on the big screen, and we hear you.
So, greetings and welcome, and I'll just do a little...
and a little reminder about maximum 10 minutes, right?
Okay? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
All right, no, because I hear you guys in the background. All right, so I'm going to do a little challenge, both to the theme as well as to the constructs of this thing we're calling peace studies and resistance studies, because I guess I want to talk a little personal and political by way of example and by way of reviewing the field. So once upon a time, when my hair was less gray, I was a student, a war resistor activist, and asked to come onto the board of an old peace research group in the United States called COPRED as the token resistor, the token activist, and those were one and the same thing. And so part of the war resistance movement, where I first met Jorgen and then Machkin and Stellan and many, many other profound and amazing people, the idea of resistance loomed large. Then, without going through the steps, I got more involved in the academy and was one of the founders of the Peace and Justice Studies Association, the founding co-chair of this organization. And there were very particular reasons why those of us that helped merge the two existing North American organizations into one, a kind of flip of what the U.S. usually does, the U.S. left usually does, which is to split in many pieces, but rather to merge and come together, and not just to merge and come together, but to merge and come together specifically affirming activists, organizers, resistors, and a connection between peace and justice, which is why it's not the Peace Studies Association, but the Peace and Justice Studies Association. And now I come to you, and I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, as the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association, which is the global consortium of the field, the mainstream of the field. So while I am sympathetic to the idea that many people in peace studies still think of it as somehow divorced from conflict escalation, that conflict is, as Matchkin said, a problem, I can't say, as a global spokesperson for the whole field, that that is the majority of the field. Nor do I think it's the majority of the field amongst PJSA people, and especially it's not a majority of the field if we take the first word in my organization's name, international, to heart. If we include all of the Africans, all of the people from Asia and Pacific, all the Latin Americans, and especially the indigenous people involved in peace research, and Polly will speak more about that, I trust, then we do not have a disconnect that Matchkin is talking about. We have an understanding. But even amongst some of the people from the global north, even amongst some of the people from the earlier days of peace studies, I remember one of the elder white dudes from the US saying, my God, all this talk about conflict resolution, I didn't realize we were coming here to resolve conflict. I thought we were coming here to create creative, nonviolent conflict to make justice. So even some of the elders understood this problematic. And like any field, if you grow and if you get mainstream, some folks are going to try to make that mainstreamatization, make that sort of cookie cutter, anti-radical approach a part of their rhetoric. But it's not something I think that's existing correctly in the majority of the field. It may exist in more of the books, especially books published in the global north, than we like to see. But there's also a way that you can make resistance studies about white people from the north. So my suggestion is that real resistance, and I have a foot in both doors, in addition to being Secretary General of IPRA, I'm a proud member of the Resistance Studies Initiative and Resistance Studies Network, and work closely with it, because really the cutting edge parts of this discipline are about a true internationalization, a true look at anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal study, a true look at the indigenous roots all around the world of conflict, conflict management, and conflict resolution, which is to say escalation of the contradictions so that justice is at the center of the work. And finally, and ultimately, an idea that our job is in looking at one another from everyday life resistance, not taking any strategy, any tactic, or any ideology and promoting it as the center, and certainly not having people who are traditionally people in power be the gatekeepers of any word, any phrase, any concept of ours, not peace, not nonviolence, and even not justice. I guess I'll say a few more concrete things. Most of my life and my work has been focused in contemporary African solidarity and African studies. And so it's not, in some ways, a surprise that my efforts these last 6 months have focused tremendously on a conference taking place in 3 weeks in Juba, South Sudan. But it's not just one conference, it's 3 or 4 conferences. At the center of it is IPRA's regional association, PGSA's African counterpart, the African Peace Research and Education Network, that will be having a major conference including Archbishop Tutu's grandson, but not just that, Murray Fanon's daughter, and activists and scholars from around the continent talking about not just theory, but the practice of nonviolent resistance and social change on the continent. But not just that. We imagine this conference to take place in the world's youngest country and to take place with an explicit review of how a state that was in conflict, a struggle for independence, has been looking at conflict creatively to construct a new society in the shell of the old. So South Sudan is a special place, and our colleagues in South Sudan, our comrades there, are going to be building up and showing us some of their creative techniques. Because of that, we have people from the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. We have people from the International Peace Bureau. We have people from the War Resisters International and from Pax Christi International, African as well as their international leadership, coming to Juba with us in person to understand that this is an important moment, an historic moment, not just for peace studies, not just for peace research, very much for building a genuine international peace movement around the whole world, and that peace movement is also a resistance movement. In Juba, resistance studies will be there. Actually, some of the people in the room with you now and people listening on the links virtually will be there. And our focus, as with a lot of the focus of resistance studies, is going to be a special piece of what we think is cutting edge in terms of resistance and peace research. I can't easily disentangle those two. They're mushed together for me for reasons you understand. But the piece we're going to bring there most centeredly is the role of and importance of solidarity for and an inter-exchange of best practices from still occupied peoples under military occupation, from a variety of different colonial forces of many different sides of ideological debates. So we have Puerto Rico and Tibet, US and China. We have Western Sahara and West Papua. We have Kashmir and Rojava. And, my God, Stella, I'm sure I'm missing something.
Amazonia.
There we go. So in any case, you guys can continue that in person in the room. But the idea that still occupied people still under direct military colonial rule, with different ideological enemies and different political forces of colonization, can come together and look at strategies, tactics, ideologies, and mainly look at how to use resistance in more profound ways. And when I say resistance, I'm not saying unarmed, nonviolent resistance, but the fact of the matter is many previously intensely armed struggle-focused groups, like Polisario in Western Sahara, have spent much of the last years looking much more carefully at how unarmed civil resistance can be a more substantial and possibly, hopefully, more successful way of waging this struggle, especially if they get international support from us. So I guess the last thing I'll say is, this is an official invitation to anyone who hears this message virtually, auditory, or in person in the room there. PJSA is part of this International Peace Research Association network, and I am the Secretary General, and often people in my position, and it's an elected position that gets changed every few years, bring a conference of IPRA to your home base. But we realized in the US that there was no good way of having an International Peace Research Association conference, especially not with the resistors that make up the majority of our council and our members. You see, we're not just conflict avoiders here. The fact is, we would not have the US permit visas or entrance to a conference held here. So our next major conference is going to be a truly Pan-American, Pan-African affair